A letter from Robert McDermott, dated 6th of January, 2022. Dear Gertrude, yesterday I woke with thoughts of my close friend, David Gershon, MD, who died suddenly on Monday. Today, my mind is a swirl of memories of my 40-year collaboration and friendship with you. When your devoted friend Patty and Ellen and I saw you last, thanks to COVID too long ago, we sat at a square table in a large empty room in your cozy assisted living home. You sat across from Patty, who had been visiting you monthly to read to you from your book, More Radiant Than the Sun. On your left, you held Ellen's hand. With your right hand, you traced a square on the table and looked purposefully at each of us and said simply, "We together." After our recognition, smiles of gratitude, silence, you looked at each of us again and again traced the square to include each of us and repeated, "We together." I would have loved to tell you about David Gershon, my San Francisco friend, anthroposophical physician to Ellen and me, and a serious anthroposophical researcher. Like you, he read hard books. I can picture you and David with Ellen and me at our table. If there were no COVID and you were to recover your memory and you were here in San Francisco, why, Ellen and I would drive you to Sausalito to visit your friends Arthur and Heidi Zients on their son's houseboat. Now that would be a conversation I would love to hear. It has been a long time since we co-taught Steiner's Redemption of Thinking at the Steiner Institute. Was it 1982? Or since you succeeded me as president of the Institute, or since we collaborated on your volume in the Vista series, or since you taught your course Poetry as Insight here in my department at CIIS, or since Patty, Ellen, and I visited you for lunch in your iconic Connecticut home just a short walk from the Wesleyan campus. Then, no more talk of books and ideas. It has been too long. What is it like? I am not anxious about your reception. Be sure to tell the welcoming committee that at the Rudolf Steiner School, you were a student of Henry Barnes for 8 years. If the committee members are up to speed, they will know that you raised 4 children as a single mother, and that you wrote your book Emerson's Demanding Optimism, which led the awesome Harold Bloom to refer to you as a distinguished Emersonian. You must have been in Marjorie Spock's kitchen in East Sullivan, Maine, when Marjorie said, "Oh, I do want to see the spiritual world." Not long after, Marjorie did see it. Then Patty saw it, then Jean Gallagher, and this week David Gershon, and now you. In a brief email last night, Arthur wrote simply, "We loved her." And in this new way, from here to you, across the threshold, we love you still. Thank you, Robert, for that letter.
It's quite another thing to hear it read. Bruce, thank you. It's I hadn't heard it out loud. I'm going to open by saying to you what I wrote to Fred Amrine, who wrote to me and saying he wanted to retranslate the Rudolf Steiner's Gospel of St. John, and would I like to write the introduction? And I wrote back and said, I don't at all feel ready to write the introduction to that set of lectures, which is just, it's the deepest, it's the most profound, it's like, no. So then some time passed, and then John Scott, the director of the press, somehow it happened that he asked me, and I said, you know, it's really not a good idea. I don't know Greek and I don't know German, and I'm not a scripture scholar. You definitely should ask Andrew Welburn, who does know Greek, who does know German, and does know everything. So ask, perfectly obvious, you should ask him. I mean, the beginning of Christianity talks about the Gnostics and the, every kind of background, and that it's fabulous. So then I said, well, ask a Christian community priest. And I don't know what they did with that idea, apparently nothing. And then they came back to me and I said, you should write it. And Fred said you should write it. And so I said, well, I sometimes say that if it's not my idea, it might be a good idea. And so I said, okay, I will. So I'm saying to you that I still hold this conviction that there's a lot of this, these lectures that I don't really understand very well. And I would be terribly apologetic, except that I've heard other people say that they have the same problem. So it's a very deep set of lectures. It's just as John's gospel is a very deep gospel. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then there's a jump to John, or a jump up, or a jump deeper, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so the part that I do understand is the most important lecture, the one on the raising of Lazarus. This is the key to John's gospel, but also to Steiner's lectures on John's gospel, which you may see. This is the current edition, which has been around for quite a long time. I should know this. I should have this in my head. 1940, and then revised in 1962. So it's already 60 years. The key lecture in these lectures is the lecture it has the title, The Raising of Lazarus, which is always the title for that event. It's scarcely ever, except in Rudolf Steiner's lectures, the initiation of Lazarus. So the entire, if not purpose, certainly the key to the understanding, appreciation of the Gospel of John and Rudolf Steiner's lectures on the Gospel of John is this lecture on the raising of Lazarus, which Rudolf Steiner had given 6 years earlier in the lectures that became Christianity as Mystical Fact, which Rudolf Steiner gave as a set of lectures in 1901, at the very, very beginning of his esoteric career after his experience of the cosmic Christ. That there is in those lectures this one called The Raising of Lazarus. This similar, the one that he gave in 1908 to about 9 people in a living room in Hamburg. I mean, it's a great picture, right? Not that I can picture Hamburg, but I can picture 9 people, and it's not exactly a cast of thousands. Sometimes if I show up to give a lecture and it's a sparse audience, I say, well, that's all right. Rudolf Steiner gave the gospel of introduction to the Gospel of John to 9 people in that living room. They may have been special, I don't know. I'll say a word about them in a minute. So the reason that I'm emphasizing this lecture, and when you read the lecture, if you haven't, you'll see that the entire meaning of the gospel, according to Rudolf Steiner, is the author. The author was none other than Lazarus, who hadn't died, but was being initiated, and that Jesus says, "I'm going to him now." All right. At one point, he does say he's dead, but then he says he's not dead; he's ill, and this is for the greater glory of God, and this is for you to see what's going on. All right. So Lazarus is in a tomb that Mary and Martha understood. She says, "Your master, your friend Lazarus is ill." They don't say he's dead. They ought to know. They were right there. Okay, so if you know a book, and I notice not many people do, there's a book by Elizabeth Haich, Haich, called Initiation. It's quite a wonderful book. I think Mary Jo will agree that it's a wonderful book. Very learned, mostly Egyptian initiation, and this was a Jewish initiation and raising, and the reason it was so controversial is because it was public, and that Jesus was not authorized to do initiations. So there's a power structure between the people who ran the religion and this all of a sudden upstart miracle doing rabbi, unofficial rabbi. Okay, and because he did this in public, there were people around. It was a threat to the authority of the Jewish rabbis who were in charge of Jerusalem and basically in charge of Judaism at that time and in that place. Okay, so Rudolf Steiner wants us to understand what is not understood by scripture scholars, including the great Raymond Brown, who has 2 volumes totaling must be 1,500 pages, and Bruno Barnhart, wonderful mystical teacher at the Benedictine monastery. I know it as 11 miles south of Esselen. These are great scholars. Raymond Brown's as great a scholar of John's Gospel as anybody anywhere, but they do not they talk about Lazarus as a raising and not as an initiation. But Rudolf Steiner wants us to understand that because Lazarus was initiated, as he says, you can tell by the fact that after chapter 11, he is referred to as the beloved disciple and no longer as Lazarus. So understand this. The name Lazarus is in the first 10 chapters, and the beloved disciple is the next. I remember, I guess it was in grade school, I remember such a vivid thought that Lazarus, that's outrageous. Jesus raised him from the dead, and the women were at the crucifixion and he wasn't. I remember being very put out about it, but had I known this, it would have been very helpful. I would have said, well, I'm really glad that he was there, as he should have been. Okay, so what Rudolf Steiner wants us to understand, and if you got nothing else in this introduction in this lecture, please get this much. Because he was initiated, he had direct access to esoteric insights, teachings, truths, etc., that the others, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, did not know about. And Rudolf Steiner says he knew what they didn't know. Well, of course, he was writing it probably 30 years after, because as we know, at the crucifixion, Jesus, at that point, Christ says, "Son, behold your mother, mother, behold your son." He's speaking to the initiated Lazarus. It says, he says to the disciple whom he loved. Okay, so what Rudolf Steiner is trying to get us to see or to know and to experience is that Lazarus as the beloved disciple in Ephesus, in an esoteric community that included him and the mother of Jesus, were teaching others, including Paul, who came after his experience at Damascus. So, but what we have to keep reminding ourselves is that the author of this book, and at the end he says, and I know that it is true. I am a witness. He's speaking as the initiated Lazarus, the beloved disciple. Okay, now what the other, raising the level, is what Rudolf Steiner wants us to understand, is that this document, because it is written by one, the only one that we know of, an initiate, initiated by Christ himself, is basically has expressed in words the truth or the fact of the Logos, the I am, which dwells in every human soul. And he says that the beloved disciple, author of this book, knew that because he experienced it directly. And Rudolf Steiner says that others who were not initiated would not have known what Lazarus John knew and put into this book. And the words are in the book in a way that are that have a force, because that Christ is revealed in that book as the I am. So there's very interesting discussion of I am, which is, of course, you know from the Moses experience that the voice comes and says, basically he gives a name. God, Yahweh gives a name. Say that I am, or the I am, or I am, the I am, who I am. But anyway, it's a name. It's a name that's hard to translate, but it's clear that it's a name. And one of the most important points that Rudolf Steiner makes in several different ways is that what Lazarus John knew and put into the fourth gospel is that I am is a force, is a living reality, is the Logos that dwells in the human soul. So it's not now any longer a name. It looks the same, but it is not the same. It's gone from being a name to being, the Logos being, which dwells in the human soul. So it's, Rudolf Steiner also says, right in the first lecture, that it's possible for anybody who uses an effective method such as spiritual science, and I don't know if he means only spiritual science. It's one of the things I don't know. But if a person uses spiritual science, and maybe if they use something like spiritual science, they could come to an understanding of the Gospel of John in the same way that a person can discover the truths of geometry. You can consult Euclid if you want. I don't know anybody who's ever consulted Euclid, actually. Does the Waldorf school, do the students actually see Euclid? Do they have I don't know. I never did. I never saw Euclid. But the point being that you can either consult Euclid's Elements, which has all the proofs and the propositions and etc. of geometry, which incredible to think that this person thought all that up. Anyway, he did. And in about 300 BC in Alexandria, okay, a person could get all those truths the same way that Euclid did, or you could read Euclid. And what Rudolf Steiner is saying, you can read the Gospel of John and you can meditate, you can think about it, and you can also get to the same knowledge of the Gospel of John as what John is communicating. You can actually sort of enter into it and experience it as a living force, as a powerful reality, which is why it's one of the few texts that Rudolf Steiner recommends for meditation. Just the prologue alone, he says, you'll experience not as a set of ideas, but as a force. And Rudolf Steiner said I know that he stood and spoke the Our Father out loud every day. And I think he also said the prologue to John's Gospel. I remember hearing or reading that, though, I can't prove it. Okay, so we want to get in these various ways. I'm bouncing around, I know, but I'm trying to give you the conviction that this text by the Lazarus John is a force that if we enter into it with in a spiritually disciplined way, it will be active. It will be, I love this word, efficacious. All right, it will be effective in our soul life. That's the point of the lectures. Now I want to go back to where we started with who he's speaking to. This is a little bit the context rather than message, but at least I have some, I don't know. I would like you to take it, to give it some importance. So he's speaking to, as I said earlier, 9 theosophists in 1908. If you know your chronology, you know that this is just 7 or 8 years after Rudolf Steiner's, 9 years after Rudolf Steiner's experience of cosmic Christ, but about 6 years after he began to have an esoteric, really, I guess you'd say a group, a set of followers who were seeing him as their teacher. And then it's just 1 year after the ill-fated International Theosophical Meeting in Munich, 1907, where he and Annie Besant, who really had, she must have been something. Anyway, Annie, so was Madame Blavatsky, just by the way. So this was a time when he and she both began to see the inevitability of a split. So a year later, Rudolf Steiner is in Hamburg lecturing to these 9 people in a living room. And it's very clear what he keeps repeating, namely that this occult is going to be esoteric Christian, and the core of it is the reality of the Logos. And so he's talking to people who are, as I understand it, more impressed by Krishna and Buddha than by Christ. And because they're discarnate guides, there's a Hindu and a Tibetan. One is recommending Krishna, one is recommending Buddha. And Madame Blavatsky herself is closer to Krishna and Buddha than to Christ. And Annie Besant is even further, because in addition to not being close to Christ, she is pretty fiercely opposed to Christianity, which is, I think, completely understandable, because she was an Irish revolutionary, and she was the president of the Indian independence movement. A great place to learn anti-Christianity. The Christians, after all, were the colonial power sucking the blood out of the Indian economy. So there she is, and she's a fabulous lecturer. She's brilliant, she's exciting, She's everything. And so Rudolf Steiner is at this point, during these years, 1908 to 1913, giving many lectures, or so series of lectures on, it's not true that he gave them on the Gospels, he gave them on the events depicted in the Gospels. So he really was giving a whole new set of Gospels, right? He was giving accounts of what happened, which he was able to do by virtue of having an access to, of having access to the Akashic record, wherein, as I understand it, and you probably have your own understanding, I hope you do, how he was reading the Akashic record. And I know there are anthroposophists who think that this process is inerrant, right? I have been criticized in public for saying that it is not inerrant. That is to say, it is not automatic. It is a very complicated process to turn light into words. It did not have to be completely accurate. And Rudolf Steiner is clear that he regarded Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant and even C.W. Leadbeater as being clairvoyant and making mistakes. All right. And Rudolf Steiner himself says that when I wrote this, I didn't yet see this, but then I saw that later, etc. I'm not saying that he was making mistakes, but it is a process and very complicated. Okay, so what Rudolf Steiner is trying to get us to do is to enter into the text and the author behind the text and the initiator of the author of the text, and to be open, have our soul open to these spiritual forces, spiritual powers. Okay, so what is the sort of, what is the revelation? What does it actually say? Well, as I started to say earlier, it says that the Logos is the I am, and the I am dwells in the human soul and is available to any soul that is awake to it. So the Christ dwells in the etheric, and we have access to it, but not if we're not looking. So it's every one of these great teachers. I'm particularly familiar with how many times Sri Aurobindo says that what we need to create a spiritual age are some great teachers and some great communities, without which the great teacher just wastes what they came to do. All right, so we have this gospel, which is a force, is a power, but people need to relate to it. And the I am is a great force, and people need to relate to it. And then he starts talking about the Christ will circle the earth in the etheric body of the earth. And I always thought it was not so specific, like, soon. I think Rudolf Steiner uses words like soon or will begin or something. But a new friend of mine, Neil Riley, on the East Coast, and a friend of his, Brian Murphy, sent me a text from an astrological source saying that Rudolf Steiner said it was actually 1933, which is pretty interesting because that is the year of the ascent, if that's the word, of Hitler and the then virtual decimation of Europe for the next 12 years, right at that time. And I don't want to make too much of it because the war did end, but it certainly was pretty interesting that these two counter forces, the Christ surrounding the earth and the rise of Nazism, which is certainly an overwhelming luciferic and particularly aramonic force. I'll get to the new catastrophe in a minute. Okay, so I assume you all have a relationship to the idea of the etheric, but just in case, because it's important in this series of lectures, Rudolf Steiner wants us to understand that we are, that our physical and etheric body have been created by the Logos and are sustained by the Logos, so that when we are asleep and the astral and the I leaves the physical and etheric in the bed asleep, the I that I am, which is a Logos being, which is part of Christ, and Christ is dwelling in me at that level, those parts of me, I don't know, body doesn't seem like such a good word, but anyway, those parts of me are then renewed by by the I, by spirit, by Logos, and the astral, so that the physical and the etheric can then continue. It's not very brilliant work because it's completely dependent on the I that I am, and even though I don't typically live at the level of the I, maybe you do, but most of us don't most of the time. So this is a whole. It's a new it's a revelation of the human being as a product and as held by the Logos or the I am. Now, when I said I didn't understand the lectures very well, let me explain that these are lectures. They are not books. They're not a book. And therefore, sometimes you'll get a sentence as Rudolf Steiner is in process, and he's pulling from there, and he sees who's in the room, and a lot of things are going on. And sometimes you say, wait, could you do that again? Or could you just elaborate a little bit? Or this is really interesting, but what does that have to do with Michael? What does that have to do with Sophia? And what does that have to do with, what does that have to do with, what does that have to do with, etc. So I don't have it all worked out. And to get it worked out, I think you now have to go to read the other 353 books. Okay, so also throughout these series, there's quite a bit of references to the evolution of consciousness, which he had already written about, let's say, 1909. Oh, he was writing, actually. He was writing occult science, esoteric science, at the same time. And esoteric science wasn't just stopping in a city and giving 9 lectures. This is a very careful, substantial book. The Evolution of Consciousness is about 100 pages, I think. Yeah, about right. Just same length of the chapter on the evolution of consciousness in Stuart Easton's wonderful book, Man and World, which needs to be republished. Okay, then coming closer to the end here, there's a chapter, lecture rather, on Christian initiation, which is very beautiful, but I seem like I must be getting old because I'm getting more bhakti, if you know that word, B-H-A-K-T-I, which is sort of devotional, right? I mean, I'm a PhD in philosophy, but could be that I'm spending more and more of my sort of waking hours in a more bhakti mode than in a jnana, which is the philosophical whatever mode. But in any case, his beautiful tribute to the Christian initiation, and which is basically the reenactment of the crucifixion. It's if you have no awareness of this, you might want to look at lecture 11. But it's still a wonderful, positive though it is. It's a stepping stone to the last chapter, which I find too hard to understand. It's about we purify the astral body. then we will receive the Virgin Sophia, which Rudolf Steiner says is Lazarus John's name for the mother of Jesus. He says, no, Lazarus John doesn't ever call her Mary. That's not her name. This is very confusing. If you go back and you look at the Revised Standard Version of King James or even the Madsen, it's not clear what to make of it. But in any case, he says it is the Christian initiation is a step, optional step to the Christian Rosicrucian initiation, which is really anthroposophical. All right. So it's very clear, those of you who have an interest in the Christian community, and it's also a very important lecture around 1921, where Rudolf Steiner, all the anthroposophists around him were then going to the Christian community. And he gave a pretty stern, impatient lecture saying, have you not been listening? Yes, if your karma includes your religious discipline, fine, but it's not a replacement for anthroposophy. I didn't come to bring Christianity. You have that already. I came to bring the next step, which is anthroposophy. Okay, so it climaxes with these beautiful sentences. I think I'll finish with that, though I didn't do all what I was supposed to do about evolution of consciousness. Since it's too hard for me to explain, let me read it. He says, this cleansed, purified astral body, which bears within it at the moment of illumination, none of the impure impressions of the physical world, but only the organs of perception of the spiritual world, is called in esoteric Christianity the pure, chaste Virgin Sophia. By means of all that he receives during catharsis, the pupil cleanses and purifies. See, this is gender inclusive language. I can hardly read it. Gender exclusive. Purifies their astral body so that it is transformed into the Virgin Sophia. And when the Virgin Sophia encounters the cosmic ego, the universal ego, which causes illumination, the pupil is surrounded by light, spiritual light. This is the second power that approaches the Virgin Sophia, is called in esoteric Christianity, is so called today, the Holy Spirit. I know that's profound, and I would like to understand it, and maybe you do. But I think I've spoken in the allotted time, and so I hope there are comments and questions and corrections and whatever.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of To mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love to man is child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress prays to the human form divine. Love, mercy, pity, peace, and all must love the human form.